Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, what we do on Unfortunate Ends is talk about a variety of things, including mysteries, murders, executions, and all sorts of stuff. So if you're into that, be sure to stick around. Anyway, today we'll be looking into the life and death of Leo Max Frank, a man who was accused and then convicted of the murder of Mary Phagan, a 13-year-old worker who had been let go from the factory which Leo Frank ran. He was sentenced as a result and later faced a brutal end. But was Frank even guilty of the crime? Leo Max Frank was born on the 17th of April 1884 in Cuero in the state of Texas. Yet he was raised in Brooklyn in New York City, having been relocated there in his early years. He subsequently earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the College of Engineering at Cornell University in 1906. Then, following an apprenticeship in Germany with the famed pencil manufacturer Eberhard Faber, Frank moved to the city of Atlanta in the southern state of Georgia, where he took up a senior management position at the National Pencil Company, and his uncle Moses Frank was a part owner of that factory. Frank's early years in Atlanta were happy. On the 30th of November 1910, he married Lucille Selig, who was like Frank, Jewish and of German ancestry. Throughout the early 1910s, Leo and Lucille lived pleasantly amongst a close-knit Jewish community in Atlanta, and in 1912, Leo was elected president of his local B'nai B'rith chapter, a Jewish fraternal organization. Despite their successful early start to married life, Leo and Lucille were nevertheless living in an environment which posed some considerable difficulties for its Jewish community. Atlanta had experienced rampant growth in its population in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and had become a pressure cooker of social tensions. From a small town just over 20,000 people in 1870, the city became a teeming city of in excess of 150,000 inhabitants by 1910, and this growth would continue unabated in the years that followed, with over 5,000 people entering the city each year. All of this created a mass of social problems for the city, which had outgrown its institutions very quickly, and which had not developed the mechanisms which were necessary for dealing with being a cultural melting pot. Much of this tension was increasingly directed at the city's Jewish community, and in particular, criticisms were being made of the use of child labor in Jewish-owned businesses. Frank was implicated in this practice himself, the factory of which he acted as a supervisor, engaging hundreds of child laborers in their teens to work producing pencils. Frank's life took a dramatic turn in the spring of 1913. On the 26th of April, at about midday, Mary Phagan, a 13-year-old employee of the National Pencil Company, arrived at the factory to collect her pay. She had been laid off from the factory 5 days earlier, owing to a shortage of raw materials at the factory and a lack of work for several of the employees. On the day in question, she met with Frank briefly, and he provided her with her pay. But exactly what happened next remains unclear to this day. Shortly after she met with Frank, Phagan was sexually assaulted inside the factory and brutally murdered. That night, or rather very early the following morning, at approximately 3:30 a.m., her body was found in the basement of the factory by Newt Lee, a watchman employed in the factory. The terrifying discovery was quickly reported to the police. 2 notes, evidently doctored though, purportedly written by Phagan, were also discovered, which accused the Night Witch in her murder. Within hours, an investigation was underway, during the course of which Frank was questioned. However, he was not arrested immediately. That wouldn't occur until 3 days later, on the 29th of April, when he was charged with murdering Mary Phagan. The subsequent investigation was highly problematic. Some witnesses were intimidated and even tortured by a police force which had become convinced of Frank's guilt, despite limited evidence to this effect. Much of the evidence they had was based on the testimony of Jim Conley, an African American janitor who had been employed in the factory. Conley provided 4 affidavits, each of which contradicted elements of his previous statements. The gist of Conley's contradictory testimony was that Frank had murdered Phagan and had then roped Conley into covering up the crime for him. In reality, there was already considerable evidence to suggest that Conley had committed the crime himself, not least the discovery of a shirt of Conley's, which appeared to have bloodstains, but which Conley successfully managed to argue was actually rust. Additionally, the time frame did not seem to implicate Frank, although it was established that Mary had been killed upstairs and her body was dragged into the basement. Also, it was clear that she had been killed shortly after collecting her pay from the upstairs office. Frank's movements were attested to by others for almost all of the time around them, there being simply a short 18-minute window for which Frank's movements are unknown. This made the possibility that he murdered Mary Phagan quite unlikely. Moreover, despite Conley's statements, most of the circumstantial evidence that was collected at the time favoured Frank's innocence. Nevertheless, the case now became caught up in the wide-ranging prejudices which were increasingly dominating American society at the time, particularly the anti-Semitic racism which was becoming rampant in cities such as Atlanta. These sentiments were stoked by media outlets at the time, particularly those run by the American media tycoon William Randolph Hearst, the inspiration for Citizen Kane, and by a local popular firebrand racist turned white supremacist by the name of Thomas Watson. These individuals exacerbated existing social tensions within Atlanta and Georgia more broadly at the time, and in doing so, profoundly biased the prosecution of the case and the collection of evidence. Frank was particularly denigrated as a northerner who had overseen hundreds of teenage employees who had to work for long hours for their Jewish overseer. Further anti-Semitic sentiment arose as Frank's case went to trial, particularly misconceptions within the wider society about circumcision and other practices associated with Judaism. Unfavourable testimonies about Frank's character were also presented by several female employees of the factory, which were designed to smear his disposition, though many others conversely came forward in his defence. None of these, however, added any substantial evidence to the prosecution's case. Bizarrely, the contradictions in Conley's testimonies and earlier statements were brushed aside, with it being argued that as an African American, Conley would have not been able to concoct such an elaborate tale, a racist supposition in its own right. In addition to this, witnesses came forward who stated that they had encountered Frank in the hours around the time Phagan would have been murdered, and declared that he had been agitated that day, as though he was preoccupied or concerned about something. But many noted this was unusual for Frank. He was a generally calm individual, and this was viewed as a further indication that he was guilty. Though all of this was entirely circumstantial evidence, but cumulatively it all proved damning. So after just 2 hours of deliberations, the jury found Frank guilty on the 25th of August 1913. He was subsequently sentenced to death by hanging. Yet this was not the end of it. The case had made international news headlines, and of course, the sentence was appealed. However, it was dismissed when the bench rejected Frank's appeal on the basis of technicalities in the evidence, by a vote of 7-2. In a highly curious development at the time, Conley's lawyer, William Smith, also began publicly asserting his belief that Frank was innocent, in direct contradiction of his former client's testimony. This made little difference in the court of public opinion though, and Smith was quickly ridiculed in the local newspapers and effectively run out of Georgia as a result. Then in June 1915, shortly before Frank was scheduled to be executed. The governor of Georgia, John Slayton, who was increasingly concerned about problems in how the case had been prosecuted, and evidence which pointed towards Conley as Phagan's actual killer, issued a directive which commuted Frank's sentence from death to life in prison. However, when news of the commutation was made widely known the following morning, a mob gathered outside the governor's home in an effort to make him reverse the decision, while public sentiment was still widely opposed to Frank. Slayton now declared martial law in an effort to restore law and order, but this could not prevent an incident at Midgeville State Penitentiary, where Frank was being held at the time, during which a fellow inmate cut Frank's throat with a butcher's knife upon learning of the planned commutation of his sentence. The former factory supervisor was saved only because 2 other inmates were nearby who happened to have medical training. These attended to him before he was rushed to a prison hospital where his life was saved through emergency surgery. But even then, the popular cries for Frank's head continued, led largely by Watson in the pages of his weekly newspaper, The Jeffersonian. This eventually culminated in a mob gaining access to Frank's prison in mid-August with the intention of dispensing vigilante justice. After breaking in, Frank was taken by the mob and driven over 240 kilometers to the town of Marietta, Mary Phagan's hometown. Here, Frank was handcuffed, his legs were tied at the ankles, and he was hanged from the branch of a tree at around 7 a.m. on the morning on the 17th of August, 1915. As a symbolic act, he was lynched in such a way that his corpse was left facing towards the old Phagan household. Frank was buried in the weeks that followed back in New York at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Queens. His lynching was just one of nearly 24 such killings in Georgia that same year, quickly met with condemnation, particularly in international media, which decried the anti-Semitic motives of both Frank's conviction on tenuous grounds and the brutal nature of his killing, even after the death sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment. And yet, within the United States, and the southern states in particular, the incident served largely to accelerate a growing xenophobia and anti-Semitism. A group emerged in the region who called themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan, and this was a component in the re-emergence and massive expansion of the Ku Klux Klan across America in the late 1910s and into the 1920s. Eventually, the truth did largely emerge. In 1982, nearly 70 years after the killing of Mary Phagan, Alonzo Mann, by then an elderly man, but who had been a young office attendant in 1913, came forward with new evidence. He had, he stated, seen Jim Conley, the janitor, whose inconsistent testimonies had been critical to Frank's conviction, dragging Mary Phagan's corpse down towards the basement of the factory the day she was murdered. Though this testimony was deemed insufficient and presented far too long after the case to indisputably convict the by now long deceased Conley, it was adjudged as significant enough for a review to be undertaken of Frank's case. This was sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League, and although it was originally rejected, finally in 1986, the state of Georgia pardoned Leo Frank 71 years after he was lynched. Thank you so much for watching the video on Leo Frank. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? I hope you guys have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as I upload them. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them down in the comments, or you can follow my Instagram or send them to my email. Anyway, I'll see all of you in the next unfortunate end. Thanks.